Today, Jazz Library focuses on a British-born musician who's also one of the greatest of all jazz guitarists, John McLaughlin. Later this month, on Sunday the 23rd of November, there's the climax of this year's Radio 3 London Jazz Festival with a concert at the Royal Festival Hall by a new supergroup, the Five-Piece Band, co-led by Chick Corea and the subject of today's programme, John McLaughlin. A few weeks ago I caught up with John to look back over his extensive recording career and select some of the highlights for the Jazz Library. And we began by going back to 1969 and the album that I started with, which many of us regarded at the time as an absolute masterpiece of British jazz, Extrapolation.
Well, it's very nice for you to say that, because it was really my first recording in which I was recording my own music. For me, it's like a painting, one of my first paintings, which is basically what recordings are. They're frozen images in sound. But I was very happy to have had the opportunity to record really my music, because I've been writing music since I was at school. So by the time I recorded this, I had an album's worth of music, and to have been able to play with John Sermon. And normally Dave Holland would have been on bass because he was in the band. I had a quartet. The recording, fortunately, I think was the timing that helped, because by the time I finished the recording, or rather just after the recording was finished, I went over to play with Tony Williams and Larry Young in New York in the Lifetime group. And the record came out after I'd gone, which I think really helped it. The fact that I'd gone, it was big news that one of the boys from the UK go over and play with the greats in America.
Now, you talked about the fact that you'd written a lot of music by the time the album came up, and the track we're going to hear is called Binky's Beam, which I think has a story behind it as well. It was written in memory of two brothers, I think.
Two brothers. Binky was a bass guitar player, and he was in a formation that was actually put together by Pete Brown, a modern-day poet who did a lot of the lyrics for the Cream. But I played with him on a number of occasions, and Binky was in the band, and he was quite startling talent, and really inspired me to write this little piece for him. I think shortly after that, he disappeared completely off the scene, and I heard all kinds of strange rumors, none of which have ever been confirmed to me, but all I know is that he disappeared completely. And I found that very tragic, because he was a great talent. He would have been up there in terms of great bass players in the world.
Binky's Beam from the album Extrapolation, and that's still just about available on the Polydor label. It's recorded in January 69, in fact, with John McLaughlin on guitar, my guest today, John Sermon on baritone, Brian Hodges on bass, and Tony Oxley drums. It struck me listening to that Tony Oxley, who we now think of very much in terms of the free and the avant-garde and the kind of textural side of drumming, was really going for it on that track.
I love Tony Oxley. The first time I really got to play with Tony Oxley would be in the Gordon Beck Quartet with Jeff Klein, whom I just saw recently at the Chick Corea concert in London that he did with Bella Fleck. And it was a real pleasure to see him. He was the bass player in the band. And Tony Oxley, I was just delighted.
These boots are made for walking, and that comes from the album Experiments with Pops, Gordon Beck's quartet in 1967, with John McLaughlin guitar, Jeff Klein bass, and Tony Oxley drums. That was reissued just a couple of years ago or so on the Art of Life label, having originally been out on LP on Major Minor back in the 60s. John mentioned that when his own album, Extrapolation, appeared, he'd already gone to New York to work with Miles Davis's drummer Tony Williams in his new band Lifetime.
I got a call from Dave Holland. Dave and I were living together before he left for the US, and he was in the Extrapolation band. He was replaced by Brian Hodges, great bass player. But in any event, Dave got the gig with Miles. It must have been sometime in July. Miles walked into Ronnie Scott's and saw Dave playing and said, "You want a gig? Come and join my band." And, we were thrilled. Dave's going to go over and join Miles. Anyway, on November 68, he called me and he said, "I've got somebody who wants to talk to you." And I found out that Tony had listened to a tape that had been recorded by Jack DeJohnette, who had been at Ronnie Scott's that summer also with Bill Evans' trio. And Jack loved to jam. And so Dave and we went to jam with him at Ronnie Scott's in the afternoon. And unbeknownst to me, Jack recorded this jam session. He went back, and one day, Tony, who was considering leaving Miles' group and forming Lifetime, was talking to Jack and said, I'm looking for a guitar player, And Jack said, really? Well, listen to this guy, because I just played with him, with Dave Holland, who was with Miles by this time. And so Dave and Tony were playing together. And so they heard about me, and Tony called me and said, I want to do Lifetime with you, which was just a thrill, absolute thrill. But of course, we had to get some things together, and Ronnie Scott was very kind to me, God bless him, because at that time I had to have a special paper to get my visa to go to America. It was a little tricky in those days. But it was really one of the greatest things that could have happened to me, I think, to get this call from Tony.
Well, that's Allaby praised by Tony Williams' Lifetime. Lifetime's slightly hard to get hold of these days, but this is on a Verve album of John McLaughlin material called Compact Jazz. So you can find that amongst a number of other relatively early recordings by John and some more recent tracks which we might come on to later. But John, the key thing about that, the piece was written by Larry Young, who played organ there, and it's a dramatic updating, really, of the organ trio. I mean, the way that you and he worked together was quite splendid.
I didn't even know until the first rehearsal who was in Lifetime, except Tony and me. And when I walked into the Baron Club, which was where Tony was playing with Miles, finishing the last week, this is how I got to meet Miles on the same day, because we rehearsed in the afternoon because Tony's drums were set up at the Baron Club up in Harlem. And in walked Larry Young. And I was so thrilled because Larry had made these recordings like Complete Unity, I think it's called, with Woody Shaw, Joe Henderson and Alvin. And he'd done recording with Grant Green, this great guitar player. And he was the new Hammond organ player. And I'd grown up with Hammond organ, of course, with Mike Carr Trio, with Georgie Fame, Graham Bond, which is where, of course, I got to play with Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce for the first time. That was a very interesting group.
Grass is Greener, that's the Graham Bond organisation, with Graham on alto, plus John McLaughlin guitar, Jack Bruce bass and Ginger Baker drums. It's currently available from Rhino on a CD called Solid Bond, and that also features Graham's trio with Dick Hextall-Smith and John Heisman. John McLaughlin, it turned out, had joined the group from the Blue Flames.
I left Georgie Fame's band before he made it big because I liked the musical provocation that was in Graham's band, because Ginger was a great drummer and Jack was a great bass player. And Graham, God bless him, was a wild man on the organ and playing alto sax at the same time. I mean, this was special. But the music was really jazz R&B, and R&B was very much part of jazz to me. It still is today. It's got the blues thing which you cannot take away from jazz. So it must have been in late '69 that Jack came into New York with one of his bands. Cream had broken up by this time. He was playing at the Fillmore East, and I called Tony. I said, Jack's playing in town. Let's go down and just say hi. They got on very well together. And Tony, because basically Lifetime was Tony's band, Tony was the originator of the band with the name. I mean, I know things came out from Lifetime eventually under my name, but it's not correct. Actually, it should have been under Tony's name. But they really hit it off very well. And Tony wanted to try to get a little bit more commercial success, which we need. You need to have a certain amount of sales and a certain amount of audience attendance just to keep a band together. And Lifetime was notoriously successful musically, but notoriously unsuccessful commercially. I was lucky because when I wasn't playing with Lifetime, Miles had me playing with him. So I had best of both worlds. I was very fortunate in that way. Jack came in and we did a recording called Turn It Over. And the music did change. And Jack was singing in the band. He was a great singer. And we carried on for another year with Lifetime, but musically it really was very important, especially for me, Alan, because with Miles directed everything and everybody, but in a wonderful way, and everybody was delighted just to do it. All of Miles's musicians, they loved him, and me too. And I still do today. I miss him. And we were just happy to go whichever way Miles wanted to go. And sometimes he didn't even know which way he was going. But that's what made it interesting. With Tony, he was a very schooled musician. He studied harmony at Juilliard, which is one of the most prestigious schools in New York. And he really encouraged me to write. He liked the way I wrote music. He liked the music that I wrote. And he constantly encouraged me to write for Lifetime, which I did. And I would say it's very safe to say that the groundwork of all the music from Mahavishnu was done in Lifetime because of Tony's encouragement.
Tony Williams' Lifetime and part of Emergency, which, like the previous Lifetime track, is included on the Compact Verve anthology by today's Jazz Library subject here on Radio 3, John McLaughlin. Just before we heard that track, John mentioned his very different working experiences with Miles Davis.
Miles was in a way like a Zen master. And I'm a big fan of Zen, incidentally. And I don't know if you know what the Zen koans are, but they're very illogical statements that are designed to blow the mind of the student. Means put him in a different state where he's not thinking logically anymore. He's thinking illogically. And I don't think Miles even was aware. He was aware in his own way, but his instincts were impeccable. And he would do this to everyone in the studio. Not on live. Live, he just let you go. I mean, he was happy just to let you go. But in the studio, he would come up with the most. I mean, there's a very well-known one that the first time I was in the studio with him, which was the second day I was in New York, we were running down In a Silent Way. Very wonderful recording from Miles. In a Silent Way is a tune from Joe Zawinul, who was on the session with Herbie, with Chick. There's three giants on the keyboard right there. And Miles liked Joe's music. He always liked Joe's music. So In a Silent Way was a beautiful melody, but Joe had it with much more complex harmony that he finally did with Wayne in duet, which is astounding. Anyway, Miles didn't like it in '69. He wasn't happy with the way it sounded, so he stopped everything and he said to me, play it on the guitar, because he didn't have a voice. Anyway, I had a part and it had all of these piano chords on it with a melody. I said, you want the piano chords with the melody? Yeah, I want everything. So I said, well, that's going to take a minute for me just to get on the... Is that a fact? Just to make me sweat a little more. So I'm there and the sweat is rolling off me. And I'm looking at the music and saying, okay, I can do this there and it. And then he suddenly says, play it like you don't know how to play the guitar. In which is more Zen, you die. And I heard, and the musicians heard that. They said, that's a good one, that's a good one. Because they all knew Miles would come up and say something to everyone in the session that would really knock them out of their socks. And I'm thinking, what does he mean? What does he mean, you know? So a few seconds go by, and each second is like a month, and the sweat is rolling off me. I say, well, screw it. You know, I know one chord on guitar. I know E chord. I'm going to play it in E. I'm going to play it the way I want to do it. Okay, that's what he said. Let's go. He had the light on already when I started, recording light. So I played the melody very slow, and I just threw all the chords out. And I heard Wayne come in. I said, it sounds very nice. And then Miles and Wayne came in, and we finished the tune. And Miles had played back Tio Macero. And I heard it, and I was really astonished. That's the least I can say about astonished. I was dumbfounded how amazing it sounded. And how amazing Miles had used me to transform that tune into something completely different in a way that I would have never, ever imagined possible.
In a Silent Way, the title track of the album, which is still available from Columbia. And if you want the full personnel, then look on the Jazz Library website. That's www.bbc.co.uk/radio3/Jazz Library, and you'll find the details of this program up on that site from the time of transmission today.
This was the beginning of my association with Miles. I should just mention in passing that he was an unbelievable human being. After this recording In a Silent Way, he would invite me over to his house a lot because he really wanted guitar. I mean, he wanted me in the band, actually. But I had this thing with Lifetime, so he said, well, every time you're not working with Lifetime, you come on the road with me, which was a perfect situation for me. But I used to go over to his house because he wanted to hear guitar. He wanted to have more and more guitar in the band. And so I would do more and more recordings with him, Bitches Brew, the other recordings over the years.
Now gonna play it up and go down. Go ahead, John, play it up, and then drop down. Bang, 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 bang.
One of the many tracks featuring today's Jazz Library subject, John McLaughlin, from the complete Jack Johnson sessions by Miles Davis on Columbia. The bassist who I thought really interacted there with John was Michael Henderson, and Billy Cobham was on drums with Herbie Hancock organ. That was recorded in April 1970 during one of John's periods of working with Miles in between Lifetime tours.
In those days, Lifetime, we were struggling economically. I was really just making it. Commercially, it was not very successful. But every time I was at Miles's house, and I would say goodbye, he'd say, "Are you eating?" And he'd stuff a $100 bill in my pocket, I never ever asked him for anything, but he would just give me money all the time, made sure that I ate and I could pay my rent. And that I'll never forget.
Well, now we've got to the moment, John. You mentioned a little while ago that Lifetime had provided a huge building block for you in creating the music and the body of work that was going to be Mahavishnu. But as well as that, what were the steps that led you? Obviously, Lifetime was failing. However much you all wanted it to go on, it wasn't going to work in the way that perhaps you'd all hoped at one stage. But what were the steps that led you to form Mahavishnu?
Well, I have to come back to Miles because it's directly related to him. And it must have been around October 1970. I was on the road with Miles, and we just finished a gig at Lenny's on the Turnpike, which was a little club outside of Boston. And the musicians had gone. There was only Miles and myself in the little band room at the back. And we were just chatting. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, he turned to me and he said, "This time you formed your own band," which really threw a loop at me because he was without doubt the most honest person I'd ever met. Brutally honest. But that was great. He always knew exactly where you were with him. Always. There's no ambiguity in your relationship. And so when he told me that, I hadn't considered it at all. But you have to look at it from my point of view here, Alyn, because here we have this man that I've been admiring since the age of 15 or 16. And now I'm playing with him. I've been playing with him on and off for the last couple of years almost, and he tells me to form my own band. This is very serious. This is a serious statement. If he says it to me, then I should do it, because he said it to me. Nobody else said it to me, but he did. So in a way, I have to justify his faith in me. That's the way I saw it. Because all of these years of admiration and affection, really, because he was like a godfather to me when I arrived in America, I had to do something to justify this statement because it came straight from his heart, And so I didn't say anything to him subsequently about it, but of course I started thinking about it. And that was the beginning of the Mahavishnu Orchestra. But I should say, though, that there again, he helped in terms of the drummer, Billy Cobham, because Billy had been invited by Miles on the Jack Johnson sessions. And Billy and I really hit it off. And he was the first one I asked about the band, about coming with me in my band. And Billy was in. And really, that was the beginning. And after, it took me about 5 or 6 months to put it all together. We came out, and Miles came to see us, of course, when we were playing in New York. It was great. But he always used to come and see us to see me if he was free. That was always a very unnerving experience because he'd hear everything, every note. But I would play every note for him anyway,
The track that we're going to play is, in some sense, a very obvious one. It's the opening track of In a Mounting Flame, Meeting of the Spirits, and it was the thing that if you bought the record and you put it on, this was the first experience we all had of what the band sounded like. Well, from 1972, that's Meeting of the Spirits, the Mahavishnu Orchestra on In a Mounting Flame, which is still available on Sony. And The band, John McLaughlin, my guest, on guitar, Billy Cobb on drums, Rick Laird on bass with Jan Hammer on keyboards, Jerry Goodman violin. And it's also, John, I mean, it seems to me that this is your writing actually coming full circle. I mean, there are things, ideas that we'd heard partly formed in Extrapolation, which are now concretising in a way. The way that the three of you, Jan Hammer and Jerry Goodman, you play the themes together, the way that you got these very intricate themes opening up periods of space. It's not exactly a template for the future, but it's very much a consolidation of where you got to, it seems to me, at that stage.
Yes, I mean, I just go on my own instincts. Already in Extrapolation, you can hear my experiments with different time signatures, and this really came to full fruition with the Mahavishnu Orchestra. What was great about the Mahavishnu Orchestra was the fact that I brought the violin in. But I didn't want a jazz violin player in the band. I wanted a rock blues violin player. So I had such around. Finally, I had this band called Flock. It was based in Chicago with Jerry Goodman. And I had this guy play. And I never heard rock violin or blues violin before or since. Jerry was really unique in that. And I thought he was perfect for electric guitar and electric violin together. And it really worked a dream. It was great. Rick Laird, the bass player, we were together with Brian Auger, great bass player, and he was ready to come to America. I think he was living in London at that time. But Miles is behind it. He said, do it, and I did it. It's as simple as that.
A lot of the Mahavishnu Orchestra albums have a sort of softer side, and the track I was going to suggest we play is Thousand Island Park, which is very much acoustic and about as different from what we've just heard as it's possible to get. So two things really, John. The acoustic strain seems to have come right the way through all your writing, but secondly, obviously an interest in the instrument itself and the varieties of it.
Well, I think we have to go back in the past again, because the first guitar that I ever held in my hands was an acoustic guitar. I didn't even know what an electric guitar was. We're going back some years here, Alan. This would be, I was 11, this would be 1953. It's a beautiful instrument, and it's my instrument. The electric guitar is another form of the guitar. I guess it's like a keyboard player playing acoustic piano and synthesizer. It's got a different atmosphere, but it has a different vibe to it. And you can say things with one that you cannot with the other. And so I can express things on the acoustic guitar that cannot be expressed on the electric guitar. It's really as simple as that.
Well, this is the piece that John and I reached at the end of the last programme, namely Thousand Island Park from the Mahavishnu Orchestra album Birds of Fire. And unlike the fiery, rock-inflected sound that characterises so much of the Mahavishnu output, this reveals a softer side of John's work, focused on the acoustic guitar.
Thousand Island Park was already a reference to my own spiritual search, because Thousand Island Park was where a man called Vivekananda visited. And Vivekananda was a very pivotal figure for me in the early 70s. It still is today, but really to a great extent in those years. He was a disciple of Ramakrishna, who was a great saint, Indian saint, who had the two foremost disciples were Vivekananda and Brahmananda, and these two were very, very important people to me. Vivekananda really exemplified wonderful interior strength. And this is really where Thousand Island Park comes from. And this, of course, we have Jan playing acoustic piano, and Jerry's playing acoustic violin. It's a much more lyrical side. But this, I think, is part of the beauty of the acoustic instrument. It has a lyrical side. There's a much more energetic side to the electric music. Certainly, the Mahavishnu that people know, we were probably the loudest and fastest band ever.
We're going to stick with that label, but a very, very different band, and perhaps the one which, as much as Mahavishnu has become identified with you over the years, John, and that's Shakti. I mean, it's had various incarnations. I remember when the first album came out, and that's the one we're going to hear part of, there was again this kind of buzz of excitement that there had been about these other stages in your career, because I think all of us who read The Melody Maker in those days would sort of open it up and there would be another story about you doing something else and something different. Now, maybe Miles is behind this as well, but perhaps this is a little different.
No, he wouldn't be behind this particular move. Where should I start? Because the origins of Shakti, you can probably trace them to the 1960s, where I discovered Indian philosophy, coming out of my hippie days and ceasing to drop tabs of LSD and trying to alter my state of consciousness through natural means, which I began to practice yoga from 1968 and try meditate, figure out who I was and what everything is in this gigantic mystery in which we all live. If you're interested in any kind of interior development, you will run into India. It's inevitable, because they've been considering the nature of existence for at least 5,000 years now, while we were still living in trees, or no, maybe mud huts. And it was actually the culture, the philosophical culture, that drew me to India in the first place. It was subsequently the music that I discovered. And the great thing about the music was, Indian music I'm speaking about, was that it's all inclusive, in the sense that all the different aspects or dimensions of the human psyche or personality are included in Indian music, from the most profound to the most humorous or capricious.
Lotus Feet from the very first Shakti album on Columbia, recorded live in 1975. And there's full personnel details on the Jazz Library website. That's www.bbc.co.uk/radio3/Jazz Library. But the key partnership in this band is between John McLaughlin and tabla player Zakir Hussain. And they met not long after John had come to New York to play with Tony Williams.
There was a music shop in Soho on Bleecker Street called Music of the World. They had the tampuras, the sitars, the tablas, very hippie kind of shop. Nice people. And I was there one day and I said, if ever you get an Indian master musician coming through, call me, because I want a lesson, any kind. So he called me up one day. He said, well, I've got somebody in here, but I'm not sure what kind of lesson he can give you. I said, well, he's a tabla player called Zakir Hussain. I said, well, ask him, can he give me a vocal lesson? And so he said, can you want to give him a vocal lesson? And he said, yes. So I went down to this music shop and Zakir Hussain gave me a vocal lesson. He sings slightly better than me, really not very well at all, but better than me. In any event, we had a lot of laughs. And after this little lesson, we became very good friends. In 1972, I became a student of Dr. Ramanathan, an extracurricular student where he was studying in Connecticut at Wesleyan University, teaching South Indian music. So I began studying South Indian Veena with him. And through him, I got to meet his mridangam player. Mridangam is a double-ended South Indian drum who accompanied my teacher. And I used to hang out there when I was free because there was lots of musicians, lots of Indian musicians, and it was great for me. And through his percussion player, called Ramnath Raghavan, I met his nephew, Dr. Shankar, who was also teaching South Indian music at Wesleyan University. He was a young guy, my age. And so we started to hang out together. He was a violinist. And I thought, oh, how nice, And before long, we were hanging out and jamming together. And he was wonderful, absolutely wonderful violinist. And one day, I said to him, do you know Zakir Hussain? He said, well, I don't know. I know about him because Zakir was already a star in India. He was less well known in the West, but very well known in India. I said, well, he's a really good friend. I think we should get together. Because I'd played once with Zakir by 1972. Because the Mahavishnu Orchestra had been invited by Clive Davis to do a benefit concert in Los Angeles. And he said, you can make the beneficiary anyone you like. So I said, well, I don't want to do it for myself, but I'll do it for the Ali Akbar Khan School of Music, where Zakir was teaching in Northern California. So we did the concert, and Zakir came, and this is the first time he'd heard me play with the Mahavishnu Orchestra. And he really liked that. The following day, we flew up to San Francisco to meet Ali Akbar Khan Saab, because he wanted to meet me and just say thanks. And so we went to his house, and I had an acoustic guitar, and Zakir had his tabla, and we sat down and played in front of Ali Akbar Khan Saab, very pretentious. Alyn, I know, but Concept was there with his whiskey and cigarette, blah, 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 blah. Wonderful, fantastic experience. And Zakir was astounding. And he still is. Today he astounds me 40 years later. So I knew what Zakir could do, and I knew what Shankar could do. And I said, we have to get together. And this was around 1972, 73. So we got my teacher's Mridangam player, South Indian. We got Zakir Hussain, North Indian, Shankar on violin, and this was really the birth of Shakti.
John McLaughlin spent much of the mid-70s touring with this band and playing a specially made guitar with sympathetic strings and a scalloped fingerboard. But in 1978 he released a CD that reminded us he was still a force to be reckoned with on the electric instrument. It was called Johnny McLaughlin, Electric Guitarist, and the cover featured a visiting card of him as a young boy with his address in Sunnyside, Yorkshire. I'd always assumed that this was just mocked up for the album cover.
It was a real card. Yes, I had it made. I think it was just for my little ego, just that I exist on a card as a musician. Because since I was 11 years old, it was my dream just to be a musician. That's really all it was.
Well, the album is a kind of statement of where you are on the electric instrument up to that point. I mean, there's a lot of different bits and pieces. There's sort of 3/4 of Lifetime, there's one or two other things. But the track that I've come back to again and again from that album is the duet with you and Billy Cobham. Seems to me that a lot of the discussion we've had has been about your relationship with percussionists one way or another. I mean, we've just talked about Zakir, we've talked about Tony Williams, we talked about going back to Tony Oxley, we talked about Jack DeJohnette. I mean, percussion and you seem to fit, and this duet is really a meeting of minds.
I love drums, and actually when I was in New York, I used to have a drum kit in my loft, and I used to be able to play. I gave that up when I moved out of America. But I have tremendous love of drums and rhythm generally. And Billy, of course, one of the most outstanding drummers of our time. And this piece actually relates also in a more oblique way to the Indian traditions where there's no harmony, there's no chords, there's just sometimes a drone, well, invariably a drone, and the soloist and accompanying percussionist. So we have a kind of Western version of that Spartan situation. But with Billy, it's very easy. But the title actually comes from a very inspiring American painter called Paul Jenkins. Very fine, abstract kind of action painter. Not in the Jackson Pollock school, a later school, but very fine work, great work. And I knew him at that period. And he was very inspiring. And in fact, the title came from one of his paintings that really knocked me out. He would get this canvas, and he'd balance it on a table, and he'd get a pot of paint, and he'd pour some paint on. Then he'd start moving the canvas. It was already on a frame. And this is how he painted. And he would move the paint on the canvas in such a way. And I watched him paint. I mean, it was wonderful to see this creative side of things. It's so different from my world, but to see it in a visual sense. And I really wanted to keep it simple. And so just to have Billy and I, that was enough.
Phenomenon Compulsion, and that's from the album Johnny McLaughlin, Electric Guitarist, which is now out on a Japanese reissue from the PID label. Billy Cobham and John McLaughlin in 1978. We're going to move now to the 1980s and a disc which, the same way as Electric Guitarist, made some waves at the time. This is one that has quite a large cast of characters on it. The track we're going to hear actually features, amongst others, Bill Evans, not the pianist, but the saxophonist, and it's called Florianopolis. And this brings you back again, John, to the acoustic instrument.
It does. Just to bring it up to date in terms of electric acoustic form, by 78, which was, I think, the recording of Electric Guitarist, this was the end of the first era of Shakti, where I really wanted to move back into jazz playing, try to bring some of the things I'd learned from the Shakti years to integrate it. Really, I think this is the whole process of integration is what I've been trying to do. Because even you go back to the opening piece of A Meeting of the Spirits, you can hear the flamenco influence in a strange kind of way. but the flamenco music has been influencing me since I was 13 or 14, and I love flamenco music. And it was already there, this effect that it was having on me. So I'd come out of acoustic guitar in 78. By 84, which I think was the recording you're speaking about, the acoustic guitar was part of me. Actually, there was a group called the Translators, but much less known. I don't think there's a real recording of this group, which I was playing with a kind of an electric band, but playing acoustic guitar. With the final edition of Mahavishnu, I was playing electric guitar, but also, of course, this acoustic piece, Florianopolis, that came from this lovely city in Brazil of the same name. And really, in a way, it's a kind of reference to the admiration and affection that I have for Brazilian music that has been directly influencing jazz since the late 50s. You hear the recordings of Jobim with Stan Getz and this wonderful lyricism that's in Brazilian music, pieces that Paco de Lucia and I played subsequently in the guitar trio. I mean, this is really Brazilian music, but it's very close to jazz because of the harmonic content. So Florianopolis, in a way, was a reflection of that visit, one particular visit that I played in Florianopolis. It's such a nice name, Florianopolis, a flower city, so nice. It comes from my flower power days, Alyn, I think.
We're going to jump forward now 5 years from the mid-80s to just the beginning of the 1990s, and one of two trios with which you toured with the Indian percussionist Trilok Gurtu. This one has Dominique de Piazza on bass, and there was another one as well, I think, with
Kai Eckhart, yes.
Which played very memorably and recorded at the Royal Festival Hall in London. I've chosen the Que Alegria album because in some ways it seems to me this sees the process through a little bit longer, but I guess one could, if one was selecting an album, look at either of these two, because you and Trilok, again, we're back to you and percussionists, but it's an amazing partnership.
Yes, yeah, he truly was, because here we have, in a way, an Indian analog of myself, where you have a guy born in Bombay, growing up playing tabla, and then discovering Coltrane, Elvin Jones, and him being totally influenced by Western music and creating this new drum kit that he played on his knees, but in such an innovative way and in such an imaginative way. I'd never heard anyone play like Trilok. And he loved Tony. He loved all the drummers that I loved, Elvin and Tony in particular. But not only that, he had this stoned quality, this kind of 60s where he'd get a gong and hit it and dunk it in a bucket of water with a microphone next to it and give the most strangest, evocative sounds. I loved that. And we really got on very well together. And this trio was important for me for that reason, but for another reason. Again, I had access to a synthesizer guitar, which I'd been experimenting with since the Mahavishnu days, really from 1974. But there have always been problems with synthesizer guitar. There are still problems with synthesizer guitar. Less important, but we're still waiting as guitar players to have an instrument that can function as well as a keyboard, a synthesizer for a pianist. We still don't have it yet. But I'm still working on it because even my last record, actually 50% of the pieces I did with synthesizer guitar. So it's still this kind of love that I have for it. But what I liked about this particular trio with Trilok was that I was playing acoustic guitar, which has got this kind of antique atmosphere, contrasted directly with this modern kind of synth sounds, and with the way that Trilok played, and of course with Dominic Di Piazza or Kai Eckhart, both wonderful bass players. This was a really wonderful trio, very coherent, lucid musically, that I thoroughly enjoyed playing with.
Que Alegria, the title track of John McLaughlin's 1991 trio album with Trilok Gurtu and Dominic de Piazza. Both in the last programme and this one, John's talked about his affinity for percussionists. And one man whose name has come up several times in our conversation is Elvin Jones. In 1994, the two of them recorded together with organist Joey DeFrancesco on the Verve album After the Rain. In a moment, we'll hear Naima, a track which, like the title piece, has obvious Coltrane associations, just like Elvin himself.
When I called him to make this recording and he agreed, I was just thrilled because I love him. I grew up with him and I've listened to thousands of hours of Elvin. He was a lovely man, just a beautiful, loving human being. And that's the way he played drums. And of course I had Jody Francesco, who was with the Free Spirits, with Dennis Chambers, another amazing drummer, and myself. Another organ trio. This was a kind of return to the roots again, Alyn. But frequently I think we have to go a step backwards to make a step forwards. In any event, this was basically a double tribute, one to Coltrane and another to Elvin himself. It was a great experience. And we actually did a number of concerts in Europe, nothing in the UK, some live playing in addition to recording, and that was just outstanding. And Elvin, just a very brief anecdote. We were in the studio, we recorded in New York, but we would do a piece, and if it was great, the first take, we'd just keep that one. But there were a couple of pieces where we'd try several different takes, and there was one, we finished it, and Elvin got off his drums, and he ran across the studio. I mean, he must have been way into his 60s. He grabbed a hold of me, lifted me in the air, and it was just... like this, like I was some kid, you know. I mean, I'm 80 kilos, you know. And he just picked me up and laughed at me. He was so joyful and so happy about that particular take that we had. I mean, what a man. Amazing.
Well, that's Naima from After the Rain on Verve. That's with Joe DeFrancesco on organ, Elvin Jones drums, and my guest John McLaughlin on guitar. This is Jazz Library with me, Alyn Shipton, and John McLaughlin, looking forward to John's appearance in the not-too-distant future at the London Jazz Festival. Well, John, we're going to come right up to date, actually, talking of the London Jazz Festival, to 2006. At least that's when the album Industrial Zen came out. I think it was recorded over a year ahead of that. But this finds you back with Bill Evans on saxophone, but the track we're going to hear for Jaco, partly very important because of your relationship with Jaco Pastorius, but also has some Brits on it, Gary Husband and Mark Mondesi.
Yes, indeed, who happen to be both in my current group. It's called The Fourth Dimension, with Mark on drums and Gary playing keyboards and drums, second drums. We played recently in London, a great concert we had there. And on bass, we have another European. It's not one American in this band. We have a young Frenchman called Hadrien Ferro, who is a very, very talented young man. When I wanted to record this piece for Jaco, I'd been thinking about him, and I missed him. I'd also recently just finished a mix of the recording that Jaco and Tony Williams and myself had done in Havana, 1979, I believe. I'm very happy to be able to have done that. In any event, I was missing Jaco, and I wrote this piece shortly after. And I heard this young bass player called Hadrien Ferro. We're going back a few years now, 4 years, something like this. I heard him play, and he was absolutely meant for this piece. And so I got him to record on this piece with Mark and Gary. And at the end, I don't know if you recognize it, because it's a feature for Hadrien. Not that he plays a solo, except at the very end, where it all changes. It becomes quite melancholy, because I miss him. I'm melancholy when I miss people. And the tune becomes melancholic. And I asked Hadrien, I said, just go where you want. You hear the harmony, just go with it. And he went, and at the very end, he made this little allusion to Jaco, because he loves Jaco. Da-da-do-dee, ba-da-do-dee, ba-da-da-da-dee-da-da. You hear it on the Trio of Doom. Jaco recorded it with Herbie, I think. And it just came out spontaneously. It was so poignant how he did it. It was really perfect. So, for Jaco, anytime.
That's For Jacko from Industrial Zen on the Verve label, with Bill Evans, Gary Husband, Hadrian Farrow and Mark Mondesi, recorded in 2006 with John McLaughlin, my guest, on guitar. Well, John, we're almost at the end of the programme. We ought to have perhaps just a quick word before we come to our final album about the band that you're going to be playing with, because here you are back again with Chick Corea.
Yes, Chick, we go back a long time. And I've seen him already several times this year. He's one of the people that I've stayed in touch with over the years. Some people you don't see for years, and you're delighted to see them. I even have brothers like that. I don't write, he doesn't write, and then I see him after 3 or 4 years, and it's like I saw him yesterday. And there are lots of musicians like this. Chick, we write, we communicate frequently, we enjoy each other's music. And we've been speaking about this for a long time. And I think it's very exciting, musically exciting project. I don't know how it will be commercially, but then I gave up thinking about that a long time ago. But we've got some great players in it. Kenny Garrett on alto sax, Christian McBride on bass, fantastic bass player, and of course Vinny Colaiuta, one of my old cohorts with whom I played last year at the Crossroads Festival with Eric Clapton. I did a recording with him with Sting quite a few years ago. He's wonderful. So I'm very excited about this. Just to come to this final piece, without being maudlin, it's a piece that I wrote for my wife, and it's called Maharina. This is a play on a Sanskrit word. Maharani means great queen. Mahavishnu, this is great Vishnu. Maha is a Sanskrit word for great. And this was done on floating point, and I'm using synthesizer guitar, but it's a ballad, and I'm able to play in a way that is very difficult, almost impossible. I would say impossible to play on electric guitar in the same way. And I really am happy at the way it came out, because it's very tender.
John, thank you very much indeed for being my guest on Jazz Library. And so, from Floating Point, we'll leave you with Maharina, and from John McLaughlin and me, good afternoon.